Hello, everybody, and welcome to ADH meets Rodrigo Nunes. Did I pronounce that right?
Right enough.
Okay, okay, that's fine. And we're going to talk about Rodrigo's new book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, a theory of political organization, which I think appeared last month, or the beginning of this month?
At the end of May.
At the end of May. Okay. So almost two. Is it almost 2 months ago? Oh yeah, almost 2 months ago at Verso. And welcome everybody. I'm Eric from the ADH. Roughly said, we are a left accelerationist organization, think tank, but are also active in practical struggles and do some organizing work and basically organizing work, media work, and intellectual work. And yeah, roughly put. Really quickly, I'm going to introduce Rodrigo. Rodrigo Nunes is a professor of modern and contemporary philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He's author of Organization of the Organizationless, Collective Action After Networks, and of numerous articles in publications such as Le Temps Modernes, Radical Philosophy, South Atlantic Quarterly, Jacobin, and The Guardian. As an organizer and popular educator, he has been involved in several initiatives in Brazil and in Europe, including the first editions of the World Social Forum. Welcome, Rodrigo.
Thank you.
Hi. So, as I said, as a first introductory question, basically what's behind this book, like all of the experience, all of the feeling of the need to even write the book. And yeah, tell us about
it. This book, as I kind of touch upon in the introduction, the idea of this book has been with me for some time, but it was always going to be a book that I was going to write after another. Like, I had a more ambitious, more let's say abstract philosophical project that I was working on, until in 2013 I felt the need to actually give priority to this project, obviously because of everything that was happening at the time, that had started happening since 2011 with the Arab Spring, Occupy 15M, and then the June 2013 protests in Brazil, so on and so forth. And I felt, well, this idea that I've had for a while of writing a book about political organization, it actually could be quite useful right now. And that's when I started working on this seriously. My first book, Organization of the Organizationalists, came out in 2014 as kind of a pamphlet that provided a taster of some of the direction in which I was working. And then it took me a while to get to the actual big project that was this book, which meant that by the time that it came out, it could function at once as an intervention on a debate that to a certain extent was already past, but also as a balance sheet of sorts of everything that happened in the last decade. So it's not only, if I'd published this book then in 2015, let's say, it would be an intervention that would be talking mostly about the movement of the squares. But the fact that it's taken much longer to come together meant that I could take in the electoral turn with the primary campaign of Bernie Sanders in the US and Corbyn's election as the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, but also Podemos and the municipalist movements in Spain. I could talk about how that had come together and also the ways in which it had failed, or the ways in which it had led to different outcomes than the ones that people were expecting. So actually, I had the whole wealth of experiences of the last decade to draw from and discuss. But if you ask me what the motivation was, I'd really have to say that the strongest motivation was probably around that period, 2011, 2013, hearing a lot of what was being said by the media, by politicians, but also by activists themselves, by a whole new generation of activists that had coalesced around the so-called movement of the squares and that cycle of struggles of the start of the last decade. I was very annoyed to hear the way in which people systematically mischaracterized their own organizations. So the way in which people held on to a very mystified idea of what they were actually doing, and there was this feedback between the media, who, as usual, didn't quite know what was going on and were trying to stamp labels on it and say, oh, these are Twitter revolutions, these are Facebook revolutions. But on the other hand, this new generation of activists who had very little, had very little connection and had very little memory of what had happened a decade before during the outer globalization movement. First of all, not realizing that a number of the things that they thought were complete novelties, that were innovations of that moment, were actually had actually been talked about and tried, and in many cases hadn't quite worked 10 years before. But also were, to a certain extent, believing the hype that the media sold to them. And in the process of doing that, seriously misunderstanding what they were doing. So I always say that the strongest motivation for me was seeing people making the same mistakes that I had made 10 years before as someone who was active at the tail end of the outer globalization movement. Well, from the middle to the tail end, from 2000 onwards. And thinking, well, if I can write a book that will help people make original mistakes rather than make the same mistakes that we made 10 years ago, thinking that they are original, that in itself will be something helpful. So I guess a strong motivation was that. It's just trying to help people make new mistakes.
I think, to be honest, I think that's a wonderful formulation, and not just in like words, but simply in, okay, hey, we can't have the ambition to overcome all problems, like also societally, but simply in like, okay, not always being stuck in the same problems we confront all the time, and simply in this. I mean, you talk about in the chapter on the emergence of the modern idea of revolution and what happened to it in like the second half of the 20th century. You talk about like the middle age, the sense of time in the Middle Ages, and this mix of cyclical time and that, okay, all the experiences, like that the future was nothing that was perceived as nothing that could be different than the general horizon of experience of an individual's lifetime. And at the same, and it's like this cyclical time, and okay, everything will come back. Like, and at the same time, this eschatological time, or we're living right in front of like imminent collapse. And in a certain way, I feel like, hey, this describes our present moment actually quite well in this, okay, in our time of, okay, failing neoliberalism, but also like in our personal life horizons, I think it's okay, we're dealing with, and also in political organizing, we're dealing with the same problems over and over again. We basically crush our heads in the same like walls of deadlocks. And in the same time with climate change, we have this sense of dread of living in like shortly before imminent collapse, basically. So yeah, that's new problems. That's the thing we can not only hope for, we should work towards. A short thing that I forgot earlier, for everybody who hasn't read Rodrigo's booklet yet, which you should actually, but as like a little appetizer, I will just post 2 links into the chat, which is one is an interview with Raw Magazine, and the other one is an interview with James Butler from Novara Media, and both give a good overview over the book and some discussion of it. Okay, they are already in the YouTube chat, and here we go for the Novara link in the Zoom chat. And whatever you prefer, written or spoken, yeah, you can choose as like a little appetizer of, okay, hey, is this book something for me? And yeah. Okay, then I would say
the answer is yes, of course.
Yeah. And maybe I could actually think that like some people basically embodying the kind of like, I don't want to use the word mindset, but like very harsh positions that you describe in the book itself, like that they may be very, very skeptical from the beginning of this book, and that maybe the interview could warm them up a little bit of like, oh, okay, I kind of misconstrued it, and be like this, okay, the slow radicalization into the neither vertical nor horizontal pipeline. And so
that's a fair point. I think it's easy to misunderstand where I'm coming from or what I'm trying to do if you just pick one bit of the argument and run with it while waiting to see how the other bits fit together. So yeah, I think I'm actually quite pleased with how those 2 interviews came out, the one with James for Novara and the one with Daniel Gutierrez for Raw. So I strongly recommend.
I'm gonna read the Raw. Actually, like I'm gonna read that still. So then getting like, also a formality. I would say we keep the questions to the Q&A to the Q&A box. Can everybody see that? Somebody from ADH maybe really shortly in chat. Do you have a Q&A box in your Zoom in your Zoom window? If not, if there is no Q&A box, that's fine. The chat is not like too full. You can just post your questions in chat, and I will then select them and see, okay, what fits in the right moment, and we're gonna see, okay, yeah. So you can discuss and ask questions anytime, but we will have like I have a few questions prepared that I already sent Rodrigo, and then we will kind of like get to the audience questions more and more, and yeah. So starting with the first more in-depth question, with because your book takes more of like this meta perspective of this, okay, it doesn't propose like, oh, all of the forms of organization we had so far are wrong. Now I'm proposing my silver bullet solution. You're asking the question, okay, oh, how do we even think about political organization? What are forms of political organization? And why do we run into the same problems over and over again? And it's super useful from this theoretical perspective. But if I would recommend this book to someone who is not into the theoretical debate at all, and maybe is very skeptical also of the theoretical approach, I would need to ask him, okay, how is the book still useful for this person in their concrete political work of doing any kind of organization work? So how do you think your work in the book relates to concrete empirical analysis and assessment of organizational practices? And I mean this this can be scientific empirical analysis. This can be layperson analysis of the organization itself. For example, that the organization has an archive of okay, how did this tactic, for example, that we pursued for the last 2 years, how did it work, for example? And do you provide the abstract concept that should guide and make possible people's empirical assessments? Or how does your work relate to concrete instances of empirical study and strategizing? So yeah, that's my first question immediately.
Well, I think first of all, obviously the proof of whether it can be useful or not will be in the pudding of people finding it useful or not. And obviously here I'm going to take the absolutely spurious approach to empirical evidence of treating anecdotal evidence as if it had statistical value. And I'll say that I'm really very pleased that I've had quite a few people who are organizers who have told me that they were reading the book, or that they had read the book and found it useful. So, and that is really, really, I'm not, it's not just a populist move on my part to say I'm pleased that this is happening, but because I really meant this, even though it is a funny beast of a book in the sense that it's a philosophical book it's a book of philosophy that's about organizing, which means that it probably won't get for philosophers, it's probably too applied and too concrete to be taken seriously as a philosophy book. But I was very concerned that it wouldn't just be, it wouldn't just come across as organizing explained by a philosopher to other philosophers, rather than a theoretical discourse that can be useful to people who are actually engaged in and confronted by practical problems in their everyday political practice. And there's actually a little anecdote here about the fact that I applied for some funding from the Brazilian government a while ago for this research, and it was turned down. My application was turned down, and the two main reasons that were given were the book is trying to connect very different things. It's trying to connect Marxism and cybernetics. These are two very different things. Which is funny because the implication that comes out of that is we won't fund you if you're trying to connect things that are separate. But if you're trying to connect things that are obviously connected, then sure, we'll give you money for that. But the other thing was there should be more empirical studies in the bibliography. And I realized, oh yeah, obviously to anyone who doesn't know me, this would be an obvious problem, because it won't be obvious to them that I'm also speaking from my own personal experience, but also the experience of my connections with people involved in movements in the US, in the UK, in Spain, in Germany, and obviously, of course, also in Brazil, and then that I can draw from these, from my own empirical experience, as well as from like books and studies about this. But I can draw from my own empirical experience and the experience of people I know. And in this sense, I have to say that the conceptual or theoretical problems that the book is trying to solve are all, or almost all, born from practice, either my own practice or other people's practice that I've drawn from. And what's happened was, over the years, I started realizing that a lot of difficulties that appeared downstream, so to speak, in political practice, like a lot of the intractable dilemmas and impasses that people ran into in their practice, tended to be caused by problems that existed upstream, so to speak, in the sense that like people were trying to draw conclusions from principles that they held which were contradictory, or they were running up against the fact that they had incompatible desires, or they were running against problems that were created by the fact that they were holding on to cliches and received ideas that they hadn't examined critically. And these so there were all sorts of epistemological obstacles, to use Bachelard's expressions, that were caused by problems that existed upstream, i.e. that were theoretical problems in the sense of or conceptual problems in the sense that these were the principles from which people were drawing in order to think their practice. So my idea was then to travel upriver, as it were, into the heart of darkness of this conceptual confusion, and try to solve problems there that could happen to people, that once solved there could help people solve practical problems downstream, or would prevent some problems from appearing downstream in practice. And I do give a number of examples of these problems throughout the book. Like, for example, the fact that we're both, nowadays, most people both tend to be very critical of any idea of any form of essentialism, or any idea of an interiority or some kind of interior essence of individuals that would be untouched by the exterior world. And at the same time, a lot of the time when we're having arguments about spontaneity, people are, without realizing, they are drawing from uncritically from essentialist ideas, or we, at the same time, we want to affirm that everything is connected, that everything acts and influences everything, acts on and influences everything else. And we demand the abolition of all mediations, that everything just could be expressed immediately as if it were unconnected to everything else. And perhaps the most general of all problems, the fact that very few people today hold the belief that there is a telos in history that means that, you know, at some point there's going to be this great awakening of the masses and we're going to have a revolution. And yet, because of a number of negative associations that the idea comes with, we continue to hold organizing in a very low esteem, you know, synonymous with the sad militant pushing newspapers, or the wannabe bureaucrat, or, you know, the self-appointed enlightened vanguard imparting consciousness from the outside to the masses, and systematically discount the element of organization in what we do. And in several other examples of movements across history that we would hold as positive. So perhaps this, at the end of the day, was the biggest problem that had to be solved. It's like precisely at the moment when we should believe that organizing would be the most necessary, because we don't believe in historical determinism, we also have the tendency to devalue organizing and to see it as something intrinsically bad. The way I tried to deal with these, I could have made a list of these problems and tried to deal with them one by one. But I thought another way of trying to deal with, you know, this mess of conceptual problems upstream that cause problems downstream was simply to try and start from scratch. I realized at some point, actually, political organization is an incredibly under-theorized field, in the sense that you have lots of theories about different bits of it. You have theories of the party, you have theories of social movements, you have arguments about democracy, you have arguments about what the ideal form of organization would be, but there isn't really anything that tries to account for the whole field at once. And I thought, well, maybe if you can build a theory from scratch, having these problems in mind, these problems that would appear downstream in mind, you can build it in such a way that you prevent those problems from appearing. So in a way, that's what I tried to do, which means that even though the book might be presented as, you know, especially in the first part, in the first couple of chapters, it might come across as, you know, starting from first principles, starting in an a priori fashion. Actually, that's the mode of presentation, but the investigation, the way that the Forschung took place, was often the other way around. I was working backwards from practical problems. I was working backwards from those practical impasses, and then using the conclusions I would arrive at, thinking, okay, where does this problem derive from, as information for how I was going to build the theory that I was trying to build. So this would be one broader answer. Two shorter answers would be, precisely this thing that I'm trying. One of the things that the book is trying to do is to offer a minimal balance sheet of the last decade. So to talk about, here's some stuff that was tried. Here's how it worked. Here's how it didn't work. Here's some things that were tried and people didn't pay attention to them, or didn't pay as much attention as maybe they should have to them. And there are some good ideas here that need to be tried in different contexts, or that need to be tried at a different scale. And here the main frame of reference is like the experience that will be familiar to any activist who was active in the last 10 years. And, they'll find that I am discussing lots of stuff that they went through, and using the framework that I built in other parts of the book to try and address problems that they have encountered in the last 10 years or so. And the last thing would be, I think that maybe, and I'd like to think that this is why I have this anecdotal evidence of some organizers writing to me to say they've read the book, or they're reading the book, and they found it really useful, and it got them thinking about a number of things. The figure of the organizer is a figure that actually has very little, so far, has had very little theoretical, it has been given very little theoretical dignity, so to speak. People write political theory from the point of view of the state, from the point of view of policy, what we would do if we were in charge of policy. Or people write from the point of view of the activist who's out in the streets, who's indignant, who's protesting. There's actually not a lot that's written from the point of view of the organizer, of the people who are doing more of the day-to-day work of running things and keeping things going. And I think maybe that's another thing that the book does. It offers an account of political theory seen from the perspective of the organizer, which is not a perspective that you see represented every day.
Something just came to my mind and came to my attention when you said about, okay, hey, basically the process of research of this. Okay, we have all of these problematic behavioral patterns in our organizational practice or our political activity practice, where we run into deadlocks and inability to make decisions, or power concentrates around one call. We all know these patterns, and that that basically these are not tackling every of these problems in themselves and partially, but what are what you said, upstream, the uniting conceptual problems behind them. And I see that this is more of a tricky question, and I would really because I have no answer to it from what I've read so far of the book. Is there seems to be a tension in the book that what you said it seems like you have this conceptual approach of hey, you discuss concepts and you're trying to dissolve conceptual problems, and you see people who are active in political organizing, for example, in those horizontalist movements, hold contradictory principles. And you show, oh no, these are contradictory, how you can resolve this and integrate organizing in a positive way into your practice is this and this way. but that's like the logical conceptual approach, and I can understand that completely from like the perspective of political theory. But then there's like, but I mean, conceptual motivations clearly, and this is like a no-brainer, aren't the only motivation for our actions. That's like completely clear. And so, and there are some parts, for example, in the 1 or 2 Melancholias chapter, we talk about, okay, this word is super awesome. It's like the symmetrical schismogenesis of the two lefts, of like the 1970 left and the 1968 left. And I think what you do there really shortly is you basically do like an empirical mapping of the behavioral patterns of the actually existing left or the lefts. And so basically what we do, like in terms of, okay, when we study society, okay, we map society, what are the patterns there, where are possible leverage points, where are like, okay, what are the dynamics that reproduce those behaviors that we face and that we want to struggle against. You do with the left itself in here. And so it feels like that this is not like, okay, you're giving them like, oh, look, people, here is like the conceptual solution for your behavioral problems, but you have like more of a like you might say like an approach from the outside. You're not approaching these people like as subjects who make decisions and say, oh, look, here's how you can make better decisions. But you say, oh, you're locked. See these people, we are also part of this, everybody of us to a certain extent. But it's like also an interesting process of like self-objectification of like, okay, hey, we are captured, like we don't have our own behavior completely under control. That's just how it is. And say, okay, let's look what behavioral patterns are we captured in, and where are the leverage points, how we can change that. And like basically how you would say, okay, how you would map an enemy and how you would approach that enemy. Like enemy is a strong word, but like roughly said, and that, okay, you use that same practice in regards to the left. And I found that very, very interesting. And that's like the tension of like, okay, at one hand, you have like this, oh, look, here are like all the conceptual solutions to this. You approach the people like somehow implicitly as like, oh, consciously decision-making subjects. And then you have like these moments of like, no, you're just like agents kept in these behavioral patterns, and how do we actually approach that? And there's an interesting tension. Like, was that intentional, or is that a problem that still persists for you? Or is that a tension that is even like, okay, solvable into like one or the other side? Or like we are simply always both. We are always conscious decision-making subjects, and at the same time, like unconscious agent, which are just kept in these dynamics we don't have under complete control. And we have to live with the tension and manage it.
Yeah, but that's super well observed. And although I would like to think that it's not a tension per se, or if it is a tension, the tension is in the thing that is being dealt with, rather than in the way that I approached it.
Maybe shortly, maybe a tension in the sense of when you talk about like contradiction versus real opposition. That's like, it's not a logical contradiction of, oh, we are either all conscious decision-making subjects, or we are both. We have both sides in us, and like yeah. And it's also an interesting question because it of course relates to the upcoming question of, okay, how do you relate your work to like the larger left ecology? Like in an indirect way, the question of course relates to that.
Well, obviously the answer I would probably give, and the answer that many people who would notice the signs scattered throughout the book would probably guess, is at heart I'm a Spinozan. So obviously, what I'm trying to do is at once diagnose certain effective structures that prevent prevent us from approaching the conceptual problems with fresh eyes or with an open heart. And yeah, I would say that hopefully there is a clinical intervention there, in the sense of trying to diagnose certain patterns that keep people tied to certain effective structures that are unproductive and they're not conducive to people solving the problems that they set themselves, practical or theoretical or conceptual. And obviously, there's the hope that by exposing by showing people this diagnosis, what I can do is say, well, obviously, you're never going to be entirely free from your affects. You're never going to be entirely free from your sad passions, but you can have someone point out to you when it's your sad passions that are talking. And there is the idea of organization as a trauma, and the way in which organization as a site of trauma, and the way in which the fact that organization is a site of trauma obscures the very nature of organization and what organization is, and how around the empty space left by the object of the trauma, which is organization, because organization is a site of trauma, then you avoid it, and around this empty space left by this avoidance, then you have this structure of a double melancholia, where you have two sides of the left that define themselves in opposition to one another. And each one of those sides is actually identifying with one of the sides of the problem of organization. And to really deal with the problem of organization supposes dealing with both sides at once. So there is the hope that producing such a diagnosis can help, can provide a point of reference to people, and a point of reference outside those effective structures that they can refer to and think, okay, maybe these are my sad passions talking now. Maybe I'm not approaching this with a clear head, or with an open mind, or with an open heart. Maybe I'm just assuming that everything here is a zero-sum game, that everyone is my enemy, when actually the only way to work out a solution is to understand that I'm cooperating with these people. So the tension lies in the fact that, yes, you're never going to fully overcome those the pool of those effective forces. There's no hope of ever becoming a fully rational, no hope of ever attaining fully rational Spinozan beatitude, but to have these external reference points that help you think, okay, maybe I can extricate myself from this dynamic for a second, see it as it were from outside, and approach this problem in a different way. That was definitely also part of what I hoped the practical impact of the book could be. So to help people deal with that trauma, to help people deal with that melancholia, and then also incorporate into the theory the possibility that even then people will value things in different ways. You know, you may very well think, well, yeah, sure, I recognize that more coordination could lead to better effects in this situation, but I'm not comfortable with that, and I'm not going to do it. Well, fine, I can totally understand that, but and I think a theory has to be capacious enough to, a theory of organization has to be capacious enough to incorporate the possibility of different organizational choices. At the same time, what it has to do, I believe, is to try and provide a map of what the problems from which people may make different choices are.
This is connected to like two things, but I want to like work through the question that I gave you first, but like one hint already that maybe also to the Benjamin Bratton question, but also to another upcoming question, that with the question, for example, of like, okay, you might say like, okay, mapping the problems and those trade-offs that you face, and for example, okay, hey, what do we, when we have more coordination and more decision-making capacity, what do we trade for that? It's like, okay, you can't have everything, but that at the same time, I would say an interesting and very important thing is to not like, I don't know if you do it here. I'm not completely sure. I wouldn't either say, okay, you do or you don't. Maybe there is like an ambiguity here to not reify it into like a map of choices of like, okay, hey, or we can, but rather to say, hey, for example, like it's not one of like, okay, hey, the trade-offs aren't set in stone. The trade-offs are determined by what means do we have at our disposal? What can we use? For example, stuff like communications technology and other kind of like what you might say like technology, but all of other stuff. And I'm not like a techno-utopian here or like the internet. Oh, the internet will set us free, blah blah blah. No, it's rather like an indeed that it necessitates like a detailed and also like case by case basis examination of, okay, when we say, okay, we capture like parts of technology that weren't available for us before, which give us this massive capacity for coordination that we simply didn't have before. And this will present us with a new set of possible trade-offs. Those are not the same trade-offs we were facing before. And then the question is also not like, okay, we just have to get more and more technology. So, and then all of the trade-offs will be fine. It's rather, okay, hey, what are, for example, like how is this technology designed? What kind of behavior does it incentivize and like more or less automatically trigger, which also has like its own pitfalls, etc. But this needs then like an in-depth case-by-case examination. Okay, what parts of this do we want to use? What do we want to redesign? Stuff. I think that's an important thing, to not reify, oh, we have like these eternal like trade-offs, but no, these trade-offs can in fact change, and that it's also our job to change those trade-offs. And this was more like a comment, but it developed into like a whole question, maybe. Yeah.
I would honestly say that I'm agnostic as to whether the trade-offs. I mean, it's certainly let's say the quantities in which the trade-offs present themselves change. That's for sure. And if you're dealing with particularly with different technologies, then yeah, how much you lose in order to gain something else. That you're absolutely right in saying that. Could that make certain trade-offs disappear? Honestly, I'm agnostic. I wouldn't answer the question either way. I think this is it's a very valid point that you're raising, and I wouldn't pretend that I have an answer to it. It's an answer that can be, as you say, can only be worked out in practice.
Basically what you said earlier with this, that was everything I was getting at, was simply like, okay, the not that, okay, certain trade-offs might completely disappear, but like that the constellation of trade-offs of like, okay, hey, oh, you sacrifice 1 unit of inclusion for 2 units of coordination, for example, like as like an abstract example, and that the relation between those things, like how many units of this do you sacrifice for how many units of this, the relation of this, that can change with new technologies, with new and not in like, okay, oh, we can just innovate. Maybe we can, I don't know, but I mean, that's not in our perspective. Yeah.
But this changes within a group of people at different times. Like this is, the quantities are changing all the time. Like say, for example, you're at a moment where everyone is highly mobilized and participating in everything at all times, which means that actually, even if you task a small group of people with making decisions, that small group of people probably have a very strong grasp of what everyone else in the group is thinking, just because everyone is all hands on the deck at that moment. And B, also because everyone is all hands on the deck at that moment, they have a stronger sense of accountability to everyone else. So even that might change the quantities that you're dealing with, but whether and I do bring Plato into the question of that part of the argument, and it could be that there is an ideal structure there that would be eternal in a sense, but certainly the way in which that structure, I mean, as one has to be in relation to ideal structures, I'm entirely agnostic there. But certainly the quantities in which, even if they do exist eternally, certainly the quantities in which they manifest themselves in each concrete situation will vary.
Okay, so now we can actually get to like the second prepared question. And that one was, where do you see, and this is actually like in my, like as I wrote you on Twitter, that this is like maybe the fundamental key question for me, at least, because it really basically it says, okay, what can people expect from this book, and what can they expect to, after they've read it, to do with it? Like what, basically to say like, okay, I invest X amount of time into reading and working through this book. What is my profit from that? Basically like that. So where do you see the limits of your work, and what do you think your work does that can be taken up by others? And what does your book enable them to do, what they weren't able to do before they've read it? And so basically, is it's okay. What do you see as the book's strategic role in our current left ecology? Yeah.
I mean, we've touched upon what some of those things could be, like the this clinical intervention around trauma and melancholia, or the fact that I think it does help dissolve some conceptual problems that people encounter, not when they're thinking about concepts, but in their direct practice. But obviously I'd like to make it clear that in the subtitle of the book, A Theory of Political Organization, the stress really should be on A. It's a theory of political organization. I don't claim to have found the theory of political organization. I think if people find that actually you need to start from scratch all over again because this hasn't done the job, then so be it. Then at least the book will have been useful as a model of something. Okay, here's something that someone tried, it didn't work. So again, making different mistakes. But obviously there's also a difficulty with this question, when you say, and also like what I tried to do, or really, both what I've tried to do and what I've managed to do in all my with all my limitations, is not really to close the question on a number of things, but really just lay down a basic framework that I believe will be generative to other people. So I believe that since we were talking about Spinoza, a student of mine once said that it would be great if the ethics, if people had compiled all the conclusions that people drew from Spinoza's ethics as an appendix. So you have Spinoza's ethics is basically a bunch of rules as to how to produce inferences. So it would have been fantastic if all the inferences that people produced from the book had been compiled as an appendix. Sadly, I'm no Spinoza. I can't produce like a huge ontological and ethical treatise from first principles, more geometrico, but really what I hope was the most useful, or will prove to be the most useful contribution here, is just laying down a basic framework that will be generative for people, that will be a set of ideas with which they can face other problems that I wasn't thinking of, that hadn't occurred to me, or that I wasn't considering, or that maybe I haven't encountered yet. And they can use that framework to find new conclusions or produce new concepts, develop new practices, etc., or find exceptions to some of the ideas that I propose, so on and so forth. Having said that, I think one of the, and also, I mean, finally, there is the difficulty with the question. There is this this interview in which Henri Bergson is asked about the theater of the future, and he says, well, obviously, I don't know what the the theater of the future is, because if I knew, I would be writing it, and it would be in the present. So in the same way, I'm only going to really know what's missing in the book when people start telling me what's missing from the book. Having said that, there are some things that I think demand more work, both theoretically and practically. One of the things that the book tries to do is to, I think, to my knowledge, it is the first to try and give a more solid conceptual footing to an idea that people have been using for a while now, which is this idea of organizational ecology or movement ecology. And I actually provide a bit of a genealogy of how I understand that concept. I mean, the more recent genealogy would be the first people that I've heard using that concept were people in Spain in 2011 or after 2011, to refer to the 15M ecology, or the 15M ecosystem. And then I wrote about it, and Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams wrote about it, and then Graham Jones, who was, he's here, has written about it. But it clearly is one of those ideas that doesn't belong to anyone, and it has some longer historical pedigree that you can trace back to the World Social Forum, to 70s Italy, so on and so forth. But it's clearly one of those ideas that is no one's idea in particular. It's something that it's a way that people started, through which people started perceiving themselves and what they were doing. And I think it's not too difficult to imagine why this way of perceiving ourselves developed now. I think, the fact that the movements of the last decade were the first movements in history where you could, because of social media data analysis, actually trace how ideas spread, how people became aware of something that was happening, or joined something that was happening, and so on and so forth. This actually provides people a very strong sense of being part of a movement ecology. So I try in the book to extract some consequences from this idea in terms of the functional differentiation that characterizes a movement ecology, the complementarity of a movement ecology, that it means that people might interact without even knowing that they're interacting with one another. What it means in ethical terms, let's say, about treating politics, not treating politics as a zero-sum game, and actually getting over our tendency to confront one another as if we were fighting over who's going to get to lead the revolution, which is a very deeply entrenched element of left socialization. And you may be a self-professed anti-vanguardist and still behave in the most excruciatingly vanguardist ways with other people. So, I've tried to do that. Have I exhausted the consequences that I think can be drawn from this idea? Absolutely not. I don't think so. I think there's a lot more work to be done there to really draw out everything that may be contained in this idea of a movement ecology. And the same goes for what I do to this idea of ecology in terms of how we think about strategy. So, I take the idea of diversity of tactics that dates back to the outer globalization movement and propose actually the way to think about ecology to think about strategy in an ecology should be a diversity of strategies, which means not a diversity of abstract theories of how to change the world, but actually a diversity of concrete strategic wages that identify potentials for building a political base and for structural choke points in capitalism around which you can build a social base, and then developing a concrete theory or developing concrete theories of change around those issues. And again, I think there's a lot of work to be done there, both conceptually in terms of fleshing out this idea, if this idea works at all. So, for example, thinking in more substantial ways about how different strategic wages interact or could coordinate with one another, but also practically in terms of working out what those strategic wages could be. I mentioned a few that strike me as strong candidates around housing, around debt, around different choke points in social reproduction, around transport, or more generally around public services. But there's a world of things to do, both conceptually and practically, in terms of fleshing out what those things could do. Finally, there is a part. There is the part of the book that was never written. The missing chapter in the book, which was going to be a chapter on affect, which you kind of feel the spectral presence of in other parts of the book, because that they are supposing a discussion on affect. But this part of the book was I didn't write it in the end because the book was already too long and I didn't have the time. But maybe I will write it. Maybe other people will, and I think that's definitely another area in which I think there's work to be done.
Yeah, I heard Verso has very strict book length restrictions.
Oh, they were incredibly generous with me on this one, because I went overboard by a considerable margin, let's say.
Okay. Then I have two things, and just one short comment, and then we get into the next one. With regards to the way you answered about, okay, hey, basically this there's like so much work, like theoretically and practically still to do, and you don't want to, like, you make suggestions. You make suggestions in, okay, how people should pick that up and work with that book, basically. but at the same, like, this is maybe more of a methodological comment of mine, that I would maybe like there is a certain hesitancy in the left to say like, okay, oh, I don't want to close the options of how people can use that tool that I give them, like this book or that theory, that idea, or whatever, and that there seems to be a certain kind of parallel between like, okay, this idea of like, oh, absolute horizontal, or like leaderlessness, that basically as soon as I give these people an answer or a thesis, it is as if I would dominate them, as if I would like enclose. And but I would like in the same kind of like structure as like Joe Friedman's tyranny of structurelessness. It's like a lot of times the effect is just the opposite of like when somebody gives an answer of like, okay, hey, this is how I think people should pick that up. And these are my reasons for that. And maybe that's a good argument. Maybe that's a bad argument. Then people have something that they can try out, or something that gives them orientation, and then they can also see, okay, no, this person was wrong in saying that, and it gives accountability. Like giving an answer introduces accountability. When somebody doesn't say anything and is hesitant and rather say, oh no, I don't want to dominate these people, don't want to enclose that, it does exactly that. It like kind of like how do you say it? I miss the word. There's the specter of authority, kind of like, because oh, what does this person mean? And if they don't have like a concrete answer, you can't like criticize this person. Yeah.
You reserve for yourself a kind of oracular position from which you can.
Yeah, it's exactly this avoidance of accountability and of saying something concrete, which then which then like the specter of authority, because it's never there, it's never asserted, but it's always like floating, haunting you in the background. I don't think you completely did this here, but I think it's a tendency we certainly have in the left and on political theory, like so much. And the other, this.
I would say if I can indirect
really short, because I want to get to the next question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I would just say there was also an element of strategy there of let's say rhetorical or discursive strategy, in the sense of if I wanted to try and keep any concrete analyses I think that I do try to indicate some directions in which I would personally take these things, but I wanted to also be careful in the sense that people could read the book without agreeing with the directions that and still find the book valuable for what it was doing, independently from what I would personally try to do with the book. But then there's another issue, which is, for a number of those things, like developing a concrete theory of change around an issue like housing. I don't actually have the knowledge that's necessary to do something like that. So, and I could acquire it and I could do it, but not here, not now. So, but yeah, I think the observation that you make is you definitely put your finger on something that's quite real there, that there's a premium on vagueness.
Yeah, and it's celebrated as a virtue, whereas it's like a lot of times I completely get this strategic calculation of, I don't want that you said, okay, consciously you kept it on like this more meta perspective, and like didn't want people to associate with like a very specific direction already, because then they would the likelihood that they would fall back exactly into the behavioral patterns that you describe and critique in the book, they would so yeah, I can, that's a good trade-off. That's an interesting trade-off. and
And
also
then they can hate me. They can hate me on Twitter.
Yeah,
afterwards.
Yeah. That's I mean,
if they can like the book and hate me on Twitter, that's fine.
And I think also one, like, there is this place for vagueness, and one can say, yeah, I don't know where this tool that I give other people here will even be useful for them, because I don't know the specific struggles they go through, or all of the possibilities that could be exhausted to it, and have like a more experimental sense. But then the point is, okay, experimental sense always has to be like coordinated with strategy. We can't just experiment. Like, experiment is like to draw conclusions from it. Did it work or didn't it work? It's not like, okay, we just do whatever and don't like make ourselves accountable for, because we want stuff that works. And yeah, so to come to the other question, because he pointed, and that's very interesting, because he pointed towards the this like data visualization of these social media networks in the cycle of struggles of like Occupy, movement of the squares, etc., etc. And now we come to the Benjamin Bratton question, because this completely reminds me of that there is this the book, your book very, very much places an emphasis, at least that's my impression, on this inside perspective of this, okay, the observer is always implicated, it is always inside the system it observes, and doesn't play much emphasis on like, okay, like an outside perspective that could objectively assess certain system and movements and strategies. And so this like element of, I would call it like cognitive self-objectification, that we don't simply see ourselves as like POV and in like our imagined images of ourselves, but really like, okay, hey, like really cold-heartedly, what is it that we are and what we do? And where our passions are not included in it, and it's completely indifferent to our own passions. And like when Benjamin Bratton, for example, like talks about like climate change as like an accomplishment of planetary scale computation, and that like the sense of an ecology of organizations and the consciousness of it emerging with the data visualization of like, because that data visualization is not a POV. That's not like, okay, that's not like that the sense of, oh, what is it that are our actual behavioral dynamics at play here, doesn't come from inside the movement, but from something completely detached, independent, outside of it. And at least it seems. And now I will get to, that's like the like kind of like getting there. And now my question, like the actual question comes, and you can connect these both aspects. That I'm talking about this book by Benjamin Bratton. It's also relatively new. It's called The Revenge of the Real: Politics for a Post-Pandemic World. And also for people who haven't, it's also pretty good, I think. It's like 160 pages, and much shorter than Rodrigo's. And there's a good interview that gives like a good overview with Bratton on the Politics Theory Other podcast. Maybe I can, or someone can search out the link and post it in the chat. It gives a good overview. And so my question is, how do you think does Benjamin Bratton's case for the necessity of governance, and he doesn't think governance for people as like, okay, necessarily tied to the state, but yeah, governance as the sensing, modeling, and on the basis of that model acting back upon itself. And again, like that society senses itself, models itself, and on the basis of these models acts upon itself, and then repeats this process all the time. And the emancipatory potentials that relate to this model of governance, and how does that relate to your conceptualization of organization and your case for ecological strategy? Yes, because you are always very much on like the, one might say like the micro and the meso level, I think, if one would make it like rough, and don't talk that much about like really like a planetary macro level. And I would be very interested how you relate to what Bratton proposes basically in the book.
Yeah. Well, I haven't. I've only read.
Okay.
I've only got a little bit into the book, and I didn't listen to his interview with Alex for Politics Theory either. But you know, I get a sense. I think I've got a good enough sense of the book to see where like what he's posing is coming from, and to get where your question is coming from. I guess the first thing to say would be that this idea of governance as sensing, modeling, and acting back, once we strip the technological language or the technological aspect in which it's couched in Bratton's argument, and once and the idea that, well, now we have the technology for it, it actually is a very old dream. It is the very old dream of a self-managed society, or of a transparent society, a society that's transparent to itself, which is a very old dream of the revolutionary revolutionary tradition. The idea of absolute democracy in Spinoza, or the idea of real democracy in the young Marx, etc. And there is this idea, there is this claim that, well, now we have the technology that's appropriate to fulfill this old dream. And certainly we do have technology that allows us to take this to a completely different level than it could have been imagined anytime before in the history of humankind. But I think that this opposition between an inside perspective and an external self-objectifying point of view needs to be complicated, because the external self-objectifying point of view, which is afforded to us by these technological possibilities that we have available today, and also by just the sheer amount of data that we're capable of gathering nowadays. This gives us a lot of data and a lot of processing power. In and of itself, it doesn't give us the questions we're asking the data and the problems we're asking that processing power to solve for us. What gives us that? It's politics. So then you have a complication of between outside and inside perspective, because yes, you have all these self-objectifying capacities that are afforded to us by technology, but at the end of the day, it's still us using these things to solve certain problems that we are posing ourselves. And then what this means at the end of the day is that the problem of what questions that data is going to be tasked with answering, but also who gets to ask those questions and by what processes one gets to decide what those questions are, become paramount. And so to the extent that these latter three questions that I just raised, like what questions we're asking the data to answer, who gets to decide what those questions are, and through what processes one, or who gets to ask those questions and through what process one gets to decide what those questions are. You have, let's say, a subjectivization of this objective point of view that would be afforded by the technology. Do you want to? You seem like you want to.
Yeah. I would interject and say, like, first of all, I think the point with all of this stuff. First of all, what kind of data is produced in the first place? What do we record? For answering what kinds of questions is that data used? Then how do we use that models? Like what normative political ends do we pursue with it? That all of this can't be answered by the technology itself, but by politics. And then the thing is also that you can't distinguish them, but into the design of the technology is the politics is built in. That certain algorithms, certain technological constructions just do collect a specific kinds of data, which then, for example, increase our or intensify our perception of individuals, which are But that's what he I think he is that's what he explicitly writes about in the book. That it isn't just let the technology solve all these problems. That there is an incredible amount of politics involved there, but it's rather that I think the function of his book then and of what he's proposing here is rather to mobilize, to show that we have the technological capacity to do that, and there is the potential, and we have to realize this potential, especially with upcoming pandemics. This won't have been our last one, and climate change. And in order to show that there is the potential, only then we can mobilize the kind of politics we need for that. If we completely disregard it and say, oh no, this is a technological dream, then also the politics for it will also fall by the wayside. And then what will happen is, because this technology will and is used anyway, will be used by other people who have hegemonized it and have their interest invested in. So it's not just do it. It's to mobilize a kind of politics, I think. And
I think this is a valuable point, and it's valuable in and of itself, and it's important that someone should do it. But we also have to remember that it's leaving aside, if you say, look at all these affordances that technology offers us, imagine what we could do if we were in charge of deciding what gets done with it. You're still not answering you're making a very valuable point, but you're not talking about some very important questions, such as who we are in that case. How do we get to be in charge of using these technologies? How do we ensure that everyone gets involved in deciding what politics is going to be built into this technology, but also what kinds of problems it's going to be directed to solving, and so on and so forth. And in that context, I would say, or in the context of, precisely, there is this whole other discussion that needs to be had. I think we should be careful not to misdiagnose as simply technophobia, what in fact may be a very healthy and legitimate skepticism, not towards the technology per se, but towards the powers, who holds the power over the technology today. Because obviously, under present conditions, to say, well, first we expand the technology to all areas of our lives, and then we work out how we can take it over, that would be a very bad strategy. It's kind of what we already have, and increasingly is what we have. And it's obviously a very bad strategy. So I think
just a short point. I completely agree with you on that. But and what you raised with the questions, all of these. Okay, who gets to decide these things? How do we get to be in power? Who is in power then? Like, but I think all of these questions, like, I think these questions need to be faced basically with the kind of attitude that you present in your book, and that is like not tied as like, oh, we pose these as abstract questions, but always in like, okay, what situation are we in? What are the possibilities we are in? And like in a strategic framework that basically, okay, what situation are we confronted in? How can we get but you only really like seriously face these questions in a concrete way when you actually face the question of, okay, hey, how can we, like, what can we do with these technologies, and how do we get control and over them and can possibly redesign them, if you actually pursue that as an active project and not just as like, oh, but there are these abstract questions which are where we don't have any answers to, then you will never actually confront these concrete questions. So I don't yeah.
And I think it also falls upon the people posing the question or trying to draw attention to the question to present prototypes of, okay, here's what we could do. Here are things that we could be doing with these things that are actually A, workable prototypes, but also B, solve the problem, the political problems, at the same time as solving technical problems. Because all I wanted to point out is, like, I think technophobia versus technophilia is the worst possible framing for this question. This is ultimately about who holds power in any given situation, you know, before or after the revolution. Who is the we who is making those decisions, and how many people get to be part of that we, so on and so forth. Which, to come back to the point that you made in relation to my book, may explain some of the reticence that you identified in terms of, I mean, you know, I used, and I actually cite a number of like data visualization studies, and like I constantly glean really valuable insight about movements from this kind of overview, so to speak. And I think we need to use more of that. But the one thing that, and you know, at the end of the book, I say, if there's one normative idea in this book, is think and act ecologically. And to think and to act ecologically means, acting ecologically means, you know, be aware of the rest of the ecology as you're acting. But that supposes that thinking ecologically means relying on all the means that we have available to us now to be aware of what the ecology is, and what it's up against, what the environment it is in which it is moving, etc., etc. What I maybe the reticence my reticence lies precisely at the level of making the passage of saying, if we all think and act ecologically, then we'll all see the same thing while looking from above. I keep open the possibility that even as we're all trying to look from above and using all the technological means that we have at our disposal, there'll still be different things that will be seen, because we'll be valuing them differently, because we will be connecting them in different ways, and so on and so forth. And yeah, it's this final unification of a we that I'm a little reticent about, because it leaves space for politics, because it leaves space precisely for dissent, for differences of opinion as to, okay, what is it that we should be doing, or that we should be asking the data, so on and so forth.
I would maybe as a last comment for that, at least like how I always try to make sense out of this problem is rather to say, okay, hey, to split it up into two realms, basically. The one is like the purely descriptive one, and you could say, okay, the purely descriptive one is also inflected with the normative one, with questions like, what do we want to count? What kind of questions do we want to ask? And so basically like normative pre-decisions in order to acquire that descriptive model. And then after that, then also comes the normative questions of, okay, hey, so what do we want to do with this data? But the thing that you could say that there is like this intermediary step of, okay, once we have decided to what is important to us, what kind of questions do we want to answer, that this the intermediary step of, okay, once we have decided what is interesting for us, that model, that kind of data that on any scale whatsoever, doesn't need to be global. It can also be like, okay, just having a study of your own organization, for example, making a study of, okay, how do people feel in the organization? How democratic how much hurt do they feel themselves? Like stuff like that. Doesn't need to be like a telescope, like fucking satellite from outside of the Earth looking at the Earth. Okay, once we have decided you might say like the question where like politics and democracy and actually human decision making is involved, then this intermediary step, that is actually something where politics doesn't play a role in its objectivity. And then the question, okay, what do we do then with that kind of data? What decisions do we make with it? Or what do we want to do with it? That's completely up to us then again. I don't have like any, okay, here's my philosophy of science, of the relation of science and politics or something like that, where I can back that up with. It's rather like a heuristic of, okay, how can you think about these things that makes you that makes it possible to deal with them in the political context, and that leaves some space for possibilities for using these things, rather than saying, oh no, everything's science or everything is politics or something like that. Because like a lot of people tend to into either one of those, but like how can you pull these things apart with like everything having its own dynamic, but still connecting them in a productive way, so that you can like use them to amplify and make your own organizational practice more productive. This is how I always as a heuristic thought about this.
And you can probably guess this from my approach in the book. This is totally how I tend to think as well. It's like it's the worst possible way to pose these questions is, should we accelerate everything, or should we hit the brakes in the locomotive of history? Well, some things need to be accelerated, some things need to be braked. The question is working out which is which.
It's exactly that. It's also like such a misconstruction of left acceleration, isn't it? A lot of people have like, yeah, just make capitalism worse, or just like technologize everything or something. And it's basically exactly this. It's accelerating towards some futures and trying to use and create possibilities that already exist, while at the same time doing everything that you can to not make other futures come into being, and to press on the brake on other tendencies in like for example into the direction of eco-apartheid or something like that. And I really need to go to the toilet, but I have a question that while I'm on the toilet you can answer, or maybe a short question in the beginning, like how much time do you have? So we have like a
well, it's almost 10 now. I mean, I don't know. Let's see if have people come up with questions.
Sadly not, but I still have like 3 of those, which I think are going to be a little bit shorter, like not as in depth, but there is one that I would ask you now, then quickly jump to the toilet and be back like when you're still answering. And that would be and I can still hear you because of Bluetooth headphones. You have like especially in the beginning, in the introduction, you make or like in the first chapter, I don't know, you make a very, very promising point that made me very hopeful with regards to how the left could like pick up this book for like discussing and strategizing in a more productive way. And I'm going to read my notes here. It's like, you say that you want to treat political organization as a domain with its own relative autonomy. That means relative autonomy in relation to like any specific political doctrine or self-identification. Like if you identify as an anarchist, as a Marxist, as like this kind of Marxist, or as a reformist, social democrat, like whatever. Like basically we all face like very similar, like we are all included in this problem of political organization, and it has its relative autonomy beyond these self-identifications. And that this shared problem allows paying attention to problems regardless of like self-identified political identification, and that this could be like a base for more productive coordination, discussion, strategizing, because it's not like just a repetition of age-old opposition and conflicts, but rather something new, something shared, something we all take part in. And like that was really promising in the beginning. And so far, at least, I feel like, okay, that it hasn't been followed up, or like maybe I just didn't pay attention enough. I don't know. It hasn't been followed up.
Jesus Christ, it's German frankness.
To its I have you.
German audiences.
Yeah.
So incredibly frank.
No, I mean, at least you make that promise. At least you have that ambition, and I think that goal is amazing. And you maybe point to this direction. But I would like, okay, hey, how could an example of this, different, for example, like groups that have different political self-identification, but have something in common through this shared problem of political organization, how could that look like, maybe in an example like that? Because it's a big and very promising promise, and I would love this to come true. I would love this. But maybe like to give it a little bit more meat. Like how could this that's basically what I'm a little bit missing so far. And I'm going to be right back, but still listening.
Well, Alan's just, okay, I'm gonna go to the toilet as well, because now we have 2 questions from Alan too, and I'm not gonna talk to your chair while you go.
Okay. Okay. So then like 1 or 2 minutes pause really quickly, and then we'll come back. Okay. Sorry for the short intermission, but we need to be able to concentrate for everybody.
Talk amongst yourselves in the meantime.
Yes. Maybe somebody from ADH can have like a little, can jump in, say something really quickly, whatever. Yeah. I think the fact that you're still here shows that you're interested, and so you won't leave, I hope. Yeah.
So yeah, in the meantime, I would again post our social media links into the chat. So if you want to follow us, if you like our current event and you want to see more, you can always follow us on social media. Wait a minute, real quick. Where we announce all of our events, and we also have like internal discussions where you can follow. So here are the links. Feel free to check it out. So, and now we wait for both to return.
All right, I'm back. Let me look at the questions. Hello, Alan, by the way. Good to see you again.
Yes, hello. Good to see you too.
Yeah, Alan, also feel free to articulate your question. You can speak if you want, if that's easier for you, if you can make it more concrete than in a writing way.
I'd rather type, and then it can just be there. I don't like to interject.
Okay, both chairs are occupied again. Yeah, I also need to read Alan's question. Hi, Alan, by the way. Or do we maybe want to first follow up with what I said about, and then we can go to Alan's questions?
I mean, I think I can answer your question very quickly. I think, you know, for example, when we talk about when I talk about, you know, thinking and acting ecologically, thinking strategies that work within the existing ecology rather than, you know, trying to imagine that you could take over the entire ecology to and put them to work for you. What I hope I'm doing there is precisely, you know, what those parts of the text do is like create these boxes that say your idea here. So this is the point where people could think of different interventions of different kinds of intervention, and hopefully they can all think their own interventions within this framework that I've set of like a movement ecology, how you conceive of yourself acting within a movement ecology, so on and so forth. So it's in that sense that that I hope I am providing problems that are common. But also, as I was saying in response to your second question, also I hope that like the building blocks that I'm offering with the theory are building blocks that people can recognize themselves in and that will be generative for other conclusions. Because more generally, there is this point about trying to isolate, like I say in this passage that you cited, to isolate this layer of organization where it could be treated as a realm with relative autonomy. And this has to do with the discursive strategy that I was talking about earlier. The goal of the book was always to try and get the broadest public possible in terms of different political allegiances. So it was really important to try and suspend the choices that I might make in order to leave the space to say, here you could make your choice. Here you could go this way or that way. But what I've mapped out for you is the place where the road bifurcates, or, you know, divides into 3, 6, however many. So yeah, this is the way in which I hope I've done that.
Like thinking of like the form of activism or politics that might be like filled with different kind of content or directed in different ways.
Yeah. That's kind of what it is. It's kind of like trying to isolate a form that would apply to whatever different people are trying to do. They would be doing different things with that. So, or there are formal tendencies that would apply to people doing different things, and they would take those tendencies in different directions. They would do different things with them. But what I'm trying to identify is what these formal tendencies are. So yeah, and in a sense, it is a kind of, in part, it is a kind of formalism of organization.
Maybe I got or maybe like a suggestion idea that basically this kind of, okay, like the point you make also with thinking ecologically is not like, okay, hey, see yourself as like this isolated actor and not only ask normative questions of, oh, what should happen, but always like, okay, what should we do in the specific context, in the specific environmental conditions we find ourselves in. And that then, okay, thinking ecologically and is, okay, that we all occupy basically like the same environment, that basically we share the same ecology, and we certainly do occupy different spaces and different places in that ecology, and so other parts of that might be more relevant to one actor than to the other actor, and so there is at least like an overlap, although it's not like, okay, everybody is facing all of the same circumstances at once. Of course, it makes a major difference if you're on the global south versus if you're in Germany, for example. But you still face like the same global capitalist economy and the same climate crisis, which has very different effects on like these different parts of the world that you immediately face. And so like, okay, that looking at this ecology and the, what you might call like the material circumstances or something like that, it's like, that is like the, like gives a common basis, which concretizes your questions of what should we do in that very moment. And therefore you have like a sharedness of these problems and questions. Is that like something in that direction maybe? And
yeah, because it's like fill in the concrete circumstances, fill in your preferences, fill in the concrete circumstances, fill in your evaluation of the conjuncture, fill in your personal preferences, and then you have your option coming out of this. But I'm trying to once you take out those things that you've filled in, what are you left with? That's what I'm trying to talk about in a way. So yeah, it is a formalism in that sense, but I hope that is a formalism that is operational once people fill it in with the missing details.
I mean, it would be really, really interesting to just try that out, for example, like with 2 or a multiplicity of different groups who all fill in these like blank spaces of, okay, what are our circumstances that are very interesting for us? What are like the wider circumstances that even if we don't see them, even if they aren't always in our attention, they are still relevant to us. And we are affected by them, our actions and decisions affect them. And to like compare, okay, what like actually just try that out basically. And I would go to Alan. If they go to Alan's question, I would just read them out. If that's is okay. Okay, 2 related questions. First, you mentioned seeing people doing things that used to not work but work now. Are these things static, or is there some sense of historical processes working and change? There was all of that talk about the return of politics a while back. Is there a different character of contemporary condition, or do things just keep working the way they always have? And the second one, I would just keep, because they relate to one another. Second, you talked about the problem of political theory imagining what would be done if we controlled the state, or what people would do in the revolution or whatever. There's a whole history of of thinking in politics about what is to be done, famously, and discussion of politics and organizing from the position of not being in power. Mao and Guerrero, which is basically a management primer. Are there not these kinds of discourses active now? And yeah, these 2 questions. And of course, Alan can like concretize if he wants, or like comment on this. Yeah,
that
feel
was
free.
yeah. Or explain if it's not clear.
Okay, in relation to the first, I mean, definitely, no, the idea is, yeah, definitely these things aren't static, and precisely there's a whole passage in the book where I discuss how to evaluate failure. But I also come to the conclusion that everything that's ever been tried has failed, which I think is a very, it's very, there's a lot of, it's very liberatory to think in those terms, because it opens lots of possibilities. There is a tendency for us in the left to treat one another as if we were like just walking psychological types, but also treating each other's theories as if they were just types. And then, oh, this guy is, Syriza, they're Euro-communists. So obviously Syriza would come to how it's to the end that it came, because they were Euro-communists. And this is, so you treat every failure as if it were simply a piece of code that is just working itself out to its natural conclusion. What you miss from that is precisely everything that you could learn from failure, which is, exactly how, even if it were a code working itself out, which it never actually is, but you miss exactly the analysis of, what were the decisive points where things could have gone in a different way, and why didn't they? What would have been necessary for them to go in a different way? So in a sense, everything is always going to be singular, because you're dealing with, even if you can identify even if you can work out some equations that remain relatively constant, the value of the variables in each situation is going to be different. So, this is why you can only learn from failure by looking at the value of the variables in each case. And in the same way, you can only try to replicate stuff that worked out in other contexts by not simply by trying to emulate what was done in a different context, but by trying to work out, okay, what would the variables be if we applied that equation to this situation? In relation to the second question, I'm not sure I understood it, to be honest. Like what kinds of discourses? You mean discourses about organizing from the position of not being in power?
Yeah, I guess like a super I related your thing of this and it seems like it's kind of recently gotten a lot kind of worse, and it maybe goes with the kind of like the media of the internet, where you have these this idea that somebody like adopts one line which is set, and it's like, oh, like you're communists versus like the anarchists, and it becomes these kind of discussions about in some like sci-fi future when we're like all the commissars of some like new world where we can what we would be like kind of writing into policy, but I mean, I feel like there is a whole history of like of these kinds of political thinking where it relates to the kind of like the conceptual level, but it's these questions of like how do communists operate kind of now in the condition of of Civil War China, of early 70s Northern Italy, Brazil in the 80s, of Brazil now, whatever, like these like and it's some part of, we have ideas that we get from history, but it doesn't mean the same thing to be an anarchist now as it meant in Spain, or as it meant in and so what's this good for, and then how do we organize ourselves in the way that we exist kind of now? Are we doing like collectives with a garden in the backyard? Are we armed cells? Are we and also like it seems like that in the problem of the kind of like the fantasy thing, it seems like often the kind of unspoken assumption is that the real organizing in that is a bunch of like academic careers, or like like it's not like actual kind of real working. It's I was wondering what the status is of thinking about material practice.
Yeah. I mean, there's a number of different questions.
Yeah.
Well, there's a number of different issues that are connected to that. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is the the crisis of both the idea of revolution and organization, which is also a crisis of the discourse on organization, i.e. precisely these theories that are not, or these discourses that are not about, okay, here's what we're going to do when we are in power, but this is what we're going to do from tomorrow on in order to ensure that at some point we're in power, or we've abolished any form of power, or we've created a new economic system, or whatever that is. So I think to a large extent, the disappearance of that form of discourse is connected to the disappearance of the traditional organized bases of the left. From the moment where the parties disappeared, where the unions started declining in terms of membership, suddenly everyone, suddenly there is no army anymore that you could imagine organizing in this or that way. And then suddenly there is nothing else to talk about in terms of organization, because you don't see anyone else, that you don't see anyone that you could organize. The challenge to start organizing anyone just becomes too huge. And that's connected, that crisis of a traditional organized base is also coincides with the crisis of the idea of revolution. And suddenly you get this split between discourses that are about, well, how do you live? How do you create alternative spaces within this world? Because changing this world is not going to happen anyway. And I quote this interview with Hacking Bay in the book, where he says that quite explicitly. He says, well, by the 80s, we realized there's not going to be a revolution. So I thought, well, how could we have an experience that would be similar to a revolution? And that's how I came up with the idea of the temporary autonomous zone. So then you have a split between, on the one hand, how do we live in this world, and then still this kind of utopian projection of, well, if we could solve the problem of how we get to change the world, in what ways would we change the world? Assuming that we've solved everything that's in the middle here, what happens after we will have solved everything that's in the middle? And that is the disappearance of the question of organization, is the disappearance precisely of that kind of discourse. And that was the kind of discourse that I was trying to renew with this book. It is true that it coincides with the disappearance of that traditional base, coincides with the fact that a lot of the left retreats, or doesn't even retreat, that's the place where it continues to exist, to academia, and since with the advent of the internet, and particularly social media, to cultural production broadly understood, both of which are spaces that are incredibly non-amenable to organization because they're incredibly atomized and individualized. The way in which you can, basically what we do is, if we're going to be very cynical about it in academia and in cultural production more broadly, is to privately appropriate the common, the intellectual commons, and say, well, this bit of it is mine, and exchange that for money and recognition.
And the form is made so you have to do that, or else you're like out. And so it's like you can write all you want about communism, but you got to keep it in your brand, and you got to compete. So
yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm as much a part of that game as anyone else. Also, like the way you get out of that game, one way to get out of that game is to just become involved in organizing stuff. And but really, like all of us, and I don't for a second pretend that I'm not implicated in that as well, are caught in that contradiction.
Okay, I would say
as
like
contradictions tend to do.
We have been going on for quite some time now, and I think maybe like maybe it's time for a last question, which is, I think, probably very, very consciously also kind of, provocative in the sense of that it kind of refers to these old splits that you're talking about in your book the entire time. And so feel free to also be agnostic, but the person is very into it. So he says, how does Rodrigo imagine, like his question, how does Rodrigo imagine the revolution? Does he bet on the workers or the ecological movement, or a coalition of both? Will there be a sweeping rise to power, or more of a hegemonic shift? Dictatorship of the proletariat or elections? Lenin or Allende? Will one country go first, or will it be an international movement? I know this is really difficult to forecast, but I was just wondering if he has some kind of prediction or dream about that. Like, yeah. The easiest question as a last question.
It's always like that. Well, maybe this one has the easiest answer too. Is like, why not all of the above? I mean, really, yeah. I don't have a good question for this. I actually propose that at the end of the book, I propose that maybe we swap positions between the concepts of revolution and transition nowadays, because of obviously transition was understood as something historically in Marxist-Leninist discourse. It was understood as something that happened after the revolution. You take over the state apparatus, and then you use the state apparatus to transition towards a different society. Nowadays, we have a discussion on that concept coming from communization theory, which basically points out, well, in actually existing experience, the transition never really transitions towards anything different. So there is a revolution you can't bank on a transitional period doing the work that a revolution must do. Where does this leave us? I think, you know, people like EndNotes are I think they're brutally honest in saying, well, you know, we don't know. Maybe the answer is an empty set. But maybe we could also try to invert the terms and think of transition as the broader concept than revolution. So a transition is something that could include revolutions, understood in several different ways, but it would certainly include like all the things that appear in the question as either or options. It could certainly include all of those happening at different happening at different times and in different places. So you know, a transitional period of history rather than a transitional state between the revolution and an end goal. How do we produce one of those? I need to get back with that answer get back to you with that answer in a few years, I'm afraid, or just, you know, change name and address so that you can't find me and ask the question again. I'm actually, the course that I'm teaching, the graduate course that I'm teaching next term is on the concept of transition, and I'm trying to read the history of the concept, but then in Marxist discourse, but then lots of other different stuff that I'm taking from cybernetics, from the socialist calculation debate, from debates on planning, logistics, scale, etc. Hopefully by this time next year, I'm going to have better answers, or at least better questions. But sadly, I can't. I'm going to use the excuse that it is too late here for me, and I'm going to leave it there for the time being.
I mean, hey, that's it. With the course, that sounds like an amazing course, like seriously, and we would love to have you back like next year, right? And then we will have to put you on a channel like, now give us the answer, and but
I'll be very glad to do it, especially if we can do it in person.
That would be
Berlin.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, really. Okay, Rodrigo. Yeah. Oh, also a last question. Jens, maybe can you post the social media links or the join link again? Because to everybody who has been watching and who liked the discussion, first, you're of course invited to follow us on our social media channels, and you can also join us. And you can also, we have a Discord channel where you can go on, where you don't have to join first, but you can get into a little bit of conversation with us and see like, okay, get to know us a little bit more. Of course, you can do that also through our website, and yeah, you can then join us, and yeah, or not if you don't want to. Yeah, you're very invited to do that. And yeah, there's a link. Perfect. Rodrigo, thank you so much, first of all, for writing this book and for the conversation. And this was great. This was really good. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Thank you for the really great questions and discussion, and thank you for the invitation and everyone who came. Alan, Stephen, Tavo, who left earlier. It's great to see you again.
Goodbye. Thanks. Good night.
Okay, and we
Take
will
care.
also we will of course like share the recording everywhere and stuff, so like more people get to see this, and yeah. Okay, so then
Brilliant.
have a good evening, and goodbye to everybody who has been watching. See you next time. Cheers.
Goodbye. Thank you.